Hey guys, welcome back to Page 3 Killers Headline Minis. So today we have a really interesting headline, which was the Golden Dragon Massacre, located in San Francisco at the Golden Dragon Restaurant on 818 Washington Street, San Francisco. Now this massacre takes place on September 4th, 1977 at approximately 2:40 a.m. And this was a gang-related shooting / mass murder. Now the weapons used by the perpetrators, which was Peter Nye, Curtis Tam, Chester Yu, Melvin Yu, and Tom Yu. Now the weapons that they used to pull this off was a .45 caliber Commando Mark III rifle, two 12-gauge pump-action shotguns, and a .38 caliber revolver. Now, the motive for this attack on the Golden Dragon restaurant was a long-standing feud between two rival gangs, the Joe Boys and the Watching Gang. Now, the Watching Gang really used the Golden Dragon restaurant as, a hangout place. So it was somewhere where they commonly went for, food and whatnot and to hang out. And this long-standing feud between these two gangs can be traced back to 1969, when the first victim in this gang war between the two occurred. Now, the two gangs controlled different parts of San Francisco. The Watching Gang was based in Chinatown, and the Joe Boys were in the Sunset District around Richmond. And they had been rivals since the Joe Boys splintered off of the Watching Gang in the late 1960s. And the shooting at the Golden Dragon was an attempted assassination of the Watching leader at that time, and was in direct retaliation to a shootout with the Watching in Chinatown's Pingyu, which was a Peace Garden housing project, on July 4th, 1977, over, I believe it was a fireworks sale. The shootout resulted in the death of 16-year-old Felix Hune and the wounding of Melvin Yu, one of our perpetrators from the Joe Boys. And the murder of Felix was a reprisal from an earlier death of a 20-year-old Watching Gang member who was shot a dozen times on May 31st while attempting to escape in his car. In planning this, the members of the Joe Boys obtained several firearms, stole a car, had other friends from other gangs basically keep tabs and follow members of the Watching Gang while they plotted this out. And the people involved in the plot itself was Tom Yu, his brothers Chester and Dana, Melvin Yu, who is of no relation to Tom, Peter Nye, Peter Chung, Curtis Tam, Cam Lee, and Don Wang. They stole a blue Dodge Dart to use as a getaway vehicle, and at approximately 2 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on September 4th, 1977, Thomas Yu received a phone call from a friend of his from another gang called Carlos, notifying him that the Watching Gang, including their leader, Michael Hot Dog Louie, was present at the Golden Dragon restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown. So Chester Yu drove a group of boys. So basically it was him, Curtis Tam, Melvin Yu, and Peter Nye to the Golden Dragon in the stolen Dodge. 45 minutes later, at 2:40, Chester Yu parked the stolen car near the Golden Dragon, stayed in the driver's seat, while the others went into the restaurant. Armed with a .45 caliber Commando Mark III rifle, which is a modern clone of the Thompson submachine gun, the two 12-gauge pump-action shotguns, and the .38 caliber revolver, the three boys, Thomas Tam, Melvin Yu, and Peter Nye, donned nylon masks and entered the restaurant from the second entrance on 8/18 Washington. During the trial of Curtis Tam, Chester Yu testified that Tam was wielding the shortened shotgun. Nye had the long barrel shotgun and a handgun, and Melvin Yu was using the rifle. Now, there was a crowd of between 50 to 100 people at this restaurant. Most of them were not gang affiliated. They were tourists, mostly. There was a couple of comedians and some police officers that were in attendance at the restaurant during the attack. Now, according to Chester Yu, Nye had instructed Tam to fire shots at the ceiling first so that when people started to panic and drop to the floor, it would be clear who was not a civilian versus who was a gang member. But that didn't happen. Without warning, the three randomly open-fired on the patrons inside of the restaurant. This killed, as I said, killed 5 people, including 2 tourists, wounding 11 others, and none of them were any gang members. And one of the shooters, Tam, said that he had been forced to join the shooting and deliberately did not target any patrons. He said the first person that he heard fire his gun was Melvin and then Peter. So when he fired his gun, he fired at an empty sofa. And testimony at Melvin Yu's trial showed that he was indeed the first to open fire using the rifle. And Melvin Yu walked directly up to a table and shot a man 9 times and continued to shoot the victim even after he had dropped to the floor. Now, the first victim of this was identified as Peter Wada, who was a visiting law student that had just been, and it was believed that he was misidentified as a gang sympathizer. The initial news report of this case identified some of the shooting victims as high-placed gang members, but that was incorrect. And the intended targets, the leadership of the Watching and the Hop Sing gangs, were sitting at a table at the back of the restaurant. None of them were injured. In fact, 10 of the members of the Watching gang had time to duck underneath of the tables, including their leader, Michael Louis, when before the gunfire even started, because somebody spotted the 3 gunmen coming up to the restaurant with their guns and shouted in Cantonese that man with a gun. It was reported that the shooting lasted around 60 seconds. The police later called it the worst mass murder in San Francisco history. After the shooting, Chester Yu drove the shooters back to the house in Pacifica, where they stayed up until dawn talking about the shooting, and then they watched the news about the killings. Then they dispatched another gentleman, Tony, who was part of the Joe Boys gang, to go pick up noodles for breakfast from the Golden Dragon, which they had just shot up, which sounds absolutely crazy to me, and I can't understand that. And later that morning, they decided to take the guns out of the closet that they had stored them in, cut them up into pieces, and dump them into the San Francisco Bay. Now, remember, I said that there was a lot of witnesses there. So some of the more important ones was comedians Philip Proctor and Peter Bergman, who were eating at the Golden Dragon after a performance of the Proctor and Bergman show at the Great American Music Hall. Now, Bergman, he was a Army veteran, and he realized when the perpetrators had emptied their weapons, so he decided to stand up from where he was taking cover so that he could get a good look at their faces. And he later was able to testify and help with getting them convicted for the murders. There was 2 off-duty police officers at the Golden Dragon during the attack, which was James Bonono, he was a restaurant patrolman. He said that he dove for cover when the gunman entered, and he later testified that he pulled his revolver and radioed for help while taking cover. I was not able to find any record of him actually trying to intervene in the shooting, so I don't know exactly what that police officer was paid to do. Once the shooting stopped, 30 to 45 seconds, he emerged and began to help the wounded diners. Now, the second police officer, Richard Harkins, also fell to the floor after hearing shots, and he drew his revolver. He stated that there were innocent people in his line of fire, so he was not able to make any effort to assist in taking down any of these offenders or anything. So he basically had people blocking his line of view, and he didn't want innocent bystanders to get injured if he decided to, take out 1 or 2 of the gunmen. Neither officers were able to identify any of the gunmen beyond describing them as young Orientals. So the 5 victims of this tragedy would be Calvin M. Fong, who was an 18-year-old recent high school graduate, Donald Kwan, a 20-year-old graduate from high school, Miss Louie, 21, she was a urban planning student at the University of Washington, Paul Wada, 25, a law student at the University of San Francisco, and Fong Wong, 48, an immigrant from Hong Kong that was a server at the Golden Dragon restaurant. Now, after the shooting, about 1 week, 2 of the Joe boys were shot by suspected watching gunmen, leaving 1 dead and another critically wounded in what the police called a revenge-motivated shooting. Michael Lee, 18, was killed, and Lo Mark Chan, 19, was wounded critically during the ambush at the entryway to Chan's Richmond district home. Now, not surprising, the Golden Dragon reopened just several hours after the shooting, but considering that it was usually open from till 3 a.m. in the morning, they decided that from now on that they would only be open till 10. And they did not have a lot of patrons coming in after dark due to, increased gang violence. So business and tourism traffic in the Chinatown section of San Francisco was severely hurt by, this gang violence, and it also caused a lot of businesses to close up. Now, in the investigation, the San Francisco Police Department announced that they were close to solving the crime soon after the shooting. And the chief of police criticized the Chinatown community for its silence. Of course, they would be afraid of gang reprisals and retaliation for, talking, which happens in pretty much any community that, has these types of issues. And he called it irresponsible for them to not speak up, which I find absolutely ridiculous, because up until now, from my understanding, the police department really didn't care about what happened in Chinatown. It only started to care when it started to hurt, the business of the city. Now, the SFPD Lieutenant Daniel Murphy, head of the investigation, said, because so many innocent people were killed and injured, this time we have been getting more cooperation out of the residents and witnesses in Chinatown than we normally do. So a lot of Chinatown residents were coming forward with tips in the days following the shooting. And they identified some of the diners as watching gang members, and identified the Joe Boys as assailants from that. Now, the mayor, George Marscone, announced a $25,000 reward for information. Now, I checked it, and it would be the equivalent of $105,000 to $110,000 today, leading to if they provided information leading to the conviction of any of the shooters. This was the largest reward ever offered in San Francisco to date. And I checked that. The unprecedented reward was eventually increased to $100,000, which was about $500,000 almost. I believe it was an equivalent of $422,000 in 2019, and that was the highest allowed reward by city law that they could offer. The SFPD received the first lead in the case 2 weeks after the shooting, pointing to Curtis Tam as one of the perpetrators. However, by December 1977, no arrests had been made, and the police, their investigation was a bit stalled. The reward was eventually collected by a Robert Wu of the Joe Boys. So he basically flipped on a bunch of his, fellow gang members. And so how that happened was Wu was arrested in March of 1978 for participating in a gang skirmish on February 15th in the Portsmouth Square, a shooting that left 2 watching members wounded. He gave the police a recording of Tam's conversating about the massacre. So he had a tape of Curtis Tam talking with some of the others about the massacre. Wu was kept in custody after that, as he had been identified as the informant. So Curtis Tam, Melvin Yu, Peter Nye, Chester, and Tom were eventually arrested after their arrest. Gunman was identified as Nye, Melvin, Tam. All were 17 years old at the time of the shooting. By August 1978, all 3 youths were being charged with being an accessory to the crimes and had been found guilty or pled guilty in closed juvenile court proceedings. Now, looking into what happened after the trials and everything, I found a lot of interesting information. So in October of 1991, Curtis Tam was released from prison, and there is no record of him after that. In 2014, Melvin Yu was granted parole. During the parole hearing, he said that he had plans to live with a cousin in Hong Kong and expected to be deported back to Hong Kong. As of 2017, a spokesperson for the Chinese consulate of San Francisco stated that there was no record of deportation requests for Yu, and Yu has been living in San Francisco since. Thomas Yu was eligible for parole in 2017, and was released around September of 2018. Peter Nye was eligible for parole in 2020, and after being denied 8 times, most recently in 2015, according to state records, he was no longer listed as an inmate, 2018. Now, this is just a really sad story, but great that they were able to get a result and arrest all of the cohorts of this crime. So, well done on that. It's just a shame that it had to happen. 5 people had to lose their lives, and 11 people had their lives changed forever. And that, everybody, is Headline Minis. So check us out. We have an episode coming up for you this week on Wednesday. We will be posting up our new episode. And later this week, I hopefully will have up a couple more Headline Minis. So, as always, guys, stay sexy and don't get murdered. Have a nice night.